Welcome to The Long-Term Investor. Today, I'm joined by Carl Richards, author of the new book, Your Money. You may know him from The Behavior Gap. Carl's known for all his sketches. He's known as episode 100 of this podcast. But Carl, thanks so much for coming back and sharing more of your wisdom.
Yeah, Peter, super excited to have this conversation.
You know, right away in the new book, you call it a conversation grenade. And I guess maybe an interesting place for us to start is, what conversations do you think that we're avoiding that really require us to be throwing a grenade into the situation?
Yeah. And I should clarify, like, what I mean by that is you know, my hope is with this book, and the sketches have always operated this way, you know, you sort of toss them in a room and conversations break out, right? But to your question, what kind of conversations are we avoiding? Well, most of us humans avoid any conversation about money, right? In our industry and people that are familiar with, like, you know, adjacent to the industry that like maybe we talk about investing, we might talk about the budgeting app that is better than the other one, or maybe we'll talk about our credit card that gets the best points, you know, our reward system. All that tactical stuff, we're sort of like, that's what it means to talk about money. And then we're surprised when we open the American Express bill and suddenly find ourselves in a fight with or as we call them around here, a heated discussion with a spouse or partner, or when a child says something like, you know, your 7-year-old says something like, "We're the richest family I know," you know, and like you're suddenly feeling some weird feeling. It turns out those are the types of conversations I want to be having. Like, money doesn't equal math, it equals feelings. And we need to get better at understanding that.
When did you realize that math beats feelings in real life? Is there any sort of like aha moment where the math answer blew up, or where does that come from?
Yeah, I think it's like the earliest work. So my earliest work was really focused around investment behavior. And this gap between, you know, how an investment does and how investors in the very same investment do, right? Because they're adding, changing, taking, you know, chasing hot dot. And early on, we sort of called that the behavior gap. And my first attempt to solve that behavior with my own clients and with myself was to spray people with facts and figures. You know, I just thought, oh, people just must not know. You know, that by this well-intentioned behavior of trying to find the best investment was leading to suboptimal results, in other words, below average returns. And I was like, oh, people just must not know. You know, all we have to do is show them the 10 best days chart, or give them the Ibbetson's mountain graph and say, see, don't you understand? And as that predictably did not work, I got deeper and deeper into the idea of like, there's a problem at the very core of this, and that's just how we even relate to money. So it was early on that you know, I probably would have said it early on that behavior, you know, your investment process only matters to the degree that it influences your behavior. And then it moved from behavior a little bit deeper and all the way down to this base level of like, you know, 2 + 2 always equals 4. 2 + 2 never equals envy. How come I touch money and I'm suddenly feeling weird things like pride, envy, fear, greed? So that's where it started.
Well, and I love hearing the background. I remember first being exposed to your work, and there's so many of these elegantly simple ideas, these aha moments that we really know once they're put in front of us, but probably forget a lot. And I think one of the things that's really special about your sketches and your work, it's not just the sketches, it's the very intentional choice of language and words that I think can allow different people to see the real point. Whereas normally two different people might see the same dollar signs, might see the same numbers on a screen, same sentence, and have totally different meanings to those things. So I guess when you try to simplify something down to its core first principle, whether it's about money or anything, honestly, I mean, what does that process look like?
That's so kind of you, because that's something I work really, really hard at. And I don't think very many people understand how much effort. There are sketches where I've been thinking about one word for more than a decade, right? Like, and one word has been like, it's not quite right. It's not quite right. So there's a lot of, and I often get it wrong, by the way. Like whenever you take something complex and make it, try to get to the point, get to the heart of the matter, and get to the simplicity on the other side of the complexity. By definition, you have to distill and edit and curate. And sometimes those editorial decisions that you make, you get wrong. Like you leave out some nuance that turns out was really important. And often I learned that pretty quickly through feedback, which is always like super helpful. But that's the goal, is to, get into a problem, understand it really. Like I think of it as, it's one of the sketches in the book, actually. I think of it as like if you think of just a line coming from the left-hand side of a piece of paper, and it seems really simple. And we could apply this to financial decisions too, right? Like, what credit card should I get? That's like such a, that'll be easy. But the moment you dive into it, you get in this ball of yarn of like, and I think of that ball of yarn as complexity, but largely it's nuance and edge cases, boundary conditions. You're like out here in the weeds thinking about this, and then at a certain point you have to decide what of that actually matters. Like, okay, well, after all of that, I think a 2% cash back is great, because then I don't have to deal with the reward systems and points I have to spend. And so, but that simple answer represented a whole bunch of work. And so that's the process of like, I'll do funny things, like I'll pull complete sentences. Like this book, every single word. Now, there are some things I would change after reading the Audible book. After reading it for the Audible book, I noticed some things, like, but it doesn't diminish that I'm like proud of every word, because in every essay, I pulled whole sentences and put them back, took out a paragraph and put it. And the question I was asking was, do I lose anything if I remove this? Sort of hunting for, what was the Little Prince said in the book, The Little Prince? Perfection is not achieved when there's nothing left to add, but when there's nothing left to take away. So my attempt was to make this book as short as possible, but no shorter.
Sure.
And that's a challenge, right?
When you do a really great job, and there are 100 sketches in there. 101. And what's really funny is you were referencing a sketch in your answer just now. I immediately knew what you were talking about before you even finished it. And I think that speaks to how memorable things are. I do have specific topic questions I want to touch on, but you had mentioned kind of like obsessing over one word for a month as you try to get the right decade. Yes. So first of all, is there a word in particular you have in mind that you want to share? Or is there something that you're wrestling with now that you haven't been able to quite distill down to that most simple, elegant point?
Yeah. So there's two that I've been thinking about for a long time, but let me give you an example of one that has been honestly on my mind for at least a decade. And it's a Venn diagram, and one circle. And by the way, if anybody listening is part of the Venn diagram police, I've already gotten all your emails. I don't need any more. I didn't realize when I first started writing the column for the Times, I would get these 2-page emails about why something wasn't a Venn diagram. And I'm like, I used to debate it. And then I realized I just would reply and say, you're right. I call them a circle sketch. So, so in one circle, it says, your use of capital. And the other circle says, what you say is important to you. That's how I first drew it. Your use of capital, what you say is important to you. And it really, and the overlap I had labeled like real financial planning. So aligning your use of capital with what you say is important to you. And the say was really bothering me. And like, because I have found, and there's, some academic work around this, that there's a big difference between stated preferences and revealed preferences, right? So I was really fond of this other saying that the checkbook and the calendar never lie. And I would often say, like, I care deeply what you tell me is important to you, but I care more about what I'll learn if I look at your checkbook and your calendar. Like, how you use your time and your money will tell me what's currently important to you. So that word say was like in conflict with other things. Like, say is a stated preference. If I see your checkbook and your calendar, that's a revealed preference. So I changed it to what's important to you. Not so your use of capital aligned with what's important to you. And again, there's what's implied there. And this is like, I thought of literally for a decade, I could talk for weeks about this, like about where this is coming from. But what's implied there is there's a bunch of work to even to even figure out what's actually important to you, and that will change. And those revealed preferences change over time. I'm not particularly proud of some of my revealed preferences versus what I would state. Like, I say time with my family, mainly outside, is the most important thing to me. And then I can show you my screen time from 3 weeks ago on a day when I said I didn't have time to go on a hike, and there was an hour on ESPN on my screen time. Well, my stated preference was I go on a hike with my daughter whenever she asks. My revealed preference was apparently ESPN was more important that day. Well, that's a whole bunch of work in one word, right? What's important to you?
I love that. And I appreciate kind of the behind the scenes look at how you think through these things. And again, as I mentioned, it just seems, I can tell how intentional the word choice is to come up with these big ideas. And I also like the example that you're giving, show me your credit card statement and I'll show in your spending or whatever. And I'm going to show you what, money goals and values are most important. What strikes me as interesting, Carl, is when I sit in on client meetings and we're going over financial plans, I think people imagine that there's going to be this big buttoned up book that's delivered and the financial plan is complete. But yet every single time you look at a plan, whether it's a day later or a month later, it's wrong. And so what do you feel like in terms of cadence on check-in? I mean, whether it's on something as simple as a one-page financial plan, which you've talked about in the past, or something more complex that has numbers and spreadsheets. I mean, what sort of check-ins do you think both prevents the tinkering that's harmful, but then keeps us adaptable and adjusting our values?
Yeah, it's the most frustrating answer ever. Like, it depends, right? But you're pointing to something really important. And this idea of financial planning is really, and investment planning, all of any sort of planning is really a process of being less wrong tomorrow, not a process of being precisely correct today. So no matter how much time you spend with the spreadsheet and calculator, which are very important, by the way, we want to get all of our assumptions right. We want to be the best guessers in the world. We want to use the best tools in the world. We want to draw the most amazing line that represents the next 3 weeks, the next 3 years, the next 30 years, whatever it is. We want to feel really good about that. And then we have to hold two competing truths in our minds at the same time. Like, we want to make the best line possible. It matters a lot. And we know it's wrong. And both of those can be true. Well, the only way to navigate an environment where uncertainty, like what's called a complex adaptive environment, is to get really clear about where you are today and then have an idea of the direction you want to go. That's that plan. And then solve for the next local optimum is what the literature says. So solve for the next step, take the next step. And then you repeat that process. When you take the next step, new information will show up. And you can incorporate that new information. And in a large way, when you take that next step, you'll learn how you were wrong. Right? So it's a very fundamental shift in posture, because it's not about protecting yourself and confirmation biasing your way and holding on to an outdated map. It's about actively looking for disconfirming evidence. And so to answer your question, we want to have these goals, like this big line that we've drawn called the financial plan, because it gives us a sense of direction, right? These goals out in the future do three things. They give us a sense of direction. They provide gravitational pull. We've all had that. Like, you write down a set of goals, you lose them. 10 years later, you find the piece of paper and you did them all, like magic. And then the third thing they do is give us hope, which I really love. But this sense of direction is back to your question, which is, how often do I stick my head up and make sure I'm directionally correct? And then how often am I in the present moment of take action, incorporate new information, take action? And I think that's largely driven, that throughput of that cycle, stick my head up, take action, is largely driven by the volatility of the situation, right? So you could imagine a client scenario where they have a pension and Social Security, the house is paid off, it's got a picket fence around it, right? Like, you're looking at that maybe once a year. And you can imagine another scenario with somebody who's got a small business that is having trouble, and you're like, you might be like, hey, you call the bank, call me back in an hour, right? And you're looking up at the directional heading, you're making micro actions. So I think that the throughput of that cycle of looking, acting, being present is driven by the volatility of the situation.
When that triggers a thought in me, because that's going to change, and something I think, although I'd have to really double check, I think you and I spoke about last time that you were on the show, was kind of this, like, the illusion, the end of history illusion, or basically that you think like you're going to stop changing yourself.
Yeah,
and
right.
So I'm 40 years old, and the things that I thought would be true about myself when I was 30 years old, like what I thought would be true about myself today, or even when I was 20, looking out to 40, are very different. And, you know, I used to think I would want to work until I'm 70. And I don't know if that's true anymore. Or I would think that, you know, I want to spend my time this way or save my money this way. And one of the things, Carl, that I find so interesting about retirees specifically is how much their viewpoint on their future self changes from the day they retire, in terms of having this purpose, this feeling of security, from the day they retire to as they continue to age and their life changes. You know, kind of looking at some of the big, it's really hard. I often try to characterize the visuals you have, but they're just so power visually. You talk about future self. You talk about the security as a feeling. You know, how do you get people to really capture these ideas and live them in their choices as they're going through a planning process?
Yeah, I think that as an industry, speaking really broadly, and even as a profession among the kind of people that you and I hang out with, I mean, financial planners who do the work, like real financial planners, we still have a tendency, certainly as an industry, we have a huge tendency, even as this little profession, we still have a tendency to have a false sense of precision about this process. Like and I think, I mean, I know, like, I want to know the end from the beginning. Like, if you please just tell, like, I personally want to, and I know that I can't, and I still want it. And I find myself sometimes desperately grasping for ground beneath my feet. You know, like, could I just find somebody who would tell me what's going to happen with tariff? You know, like whatever it is, both personal, global, you know, economic issues, political issues, but also like personally, like, where am I going to live? And I think one thing that I think we could do a better job, and it becomes really apparent with somebody in threshold times, you know, like whether that's retirement or changing of a job or a marriage or a divorce or any threshold moment, it becomes really apparent, because you're like you said, like, I mean, all you have to do is go back to January of 2020 and look at your calendar even for April to realize, like, so those are one of these moments where we get a chance to see the reality of the situation. And so what I think we could do, what I'm trying to do, and I don't know if it's useful for anybody else, is just to realize that tension, the tension of like, oh, I'm retired, it's time to just, you know, kind of shut it down for the next 20 years. The tension of what am I going to be when I grow up? The tension of who am I? We want to resolve it. And I think the better path, the more honest path, to be honest, is it's not going to ever be resolved. Like, who I am what's important to me. There's this great, Lao Tzu has this great saying, be who you really are and go the whole way. Well, and David White says, only slowly do we learn what's truly important to us and align our outer and inner lives with that gravitational pull. So I think long-winded answer is it's a process. It's never going to end. And I think if we can start embracing and start feeling like tension keeps bridges up, like that tension of I'm enough today. This is exactly what I want. And tomorrow it will change. That tension of my relationship with my wife, Peter, this is true. My relationship with my wife right now, we've been married over 30 years. My relationship with my wife has never been better. Like, never. And Peter, I hope it's better tomorrow. And the day I stop saying that, and same with my kids. Like my kids are my best friends. It's so good. And man, I hope my relationship with my 28-year-old daughter is even better tomorrow. I think that tension is embedded in the financial planning process. And I just think we need to be better about acknowledging it and being open about it.
You coach a lot of advisors on, how to look beyond the spreadsheet, how to focus on these issues that are really important, and how to do, what I think we would all agree is more real financial planning as opposed to what people will say, hey, yeah, of course I do financial planning.
Yeah.
As you coach advisors, are there things that you see people struggling with conveying messages to their clients? When they come and they say, Carl, I'm having a hard time conveying this, that, or the other to my clients or my potential clients. What are some of those things that you're hearing most?
Yeah, the most common is that, and I think, anybody listening to this, especially clients of planners who hear this, the most common challenge is that the thing you show up, I call it the presenting problem. The reason that you reach out to a planner is often a tactical issue. We're starting to realize how close retirement is, or we just sold a business, or we went on our first trip after having our second kid, realized we didn't have enough life insurance. Like whatever it is, there's this presenting problem. And often the presenting problem is even investment performance, right? Like my portfolio is doing terrible compared to my buddies at the club or whatever. You show up for a plan. What the hardest problem is that 24 months later, 18 to 24 months later into the relationship with a real financial planner, if you were to tell your friends what you value about that relationship, it would have nothing to do with the presenting problem. You wouldn't say, clients don't say, oh my gosh, Sally's been the most amazing financial planner because we have a fantastically modeled, efficient portfolio that's low cost and diversified globally. They say, I'm not worrying about money anymore. They say, I feel like I have enough, or I'm on track, or we have a plan, or I'm not even thinking about it. Like that's what they say. But nobody comes into a financial planner's office saying, please help, I would like to cry on your couch. Or please help me get clear about my goals. Nobody says that. And so I think that's the biggest challenge of communicating, is that the presenting problem is really important. Like sometimes I compare it. Like if you, it's a long story about how this analogy came up, but if you had an arrow in your arm, you were out playing with a bow and arrow with your son and you had an arrow in your arm and you go to the emergency room and the emergency room doctor says, how's the flexion in your ankle and what's your diet like? You're like, bro, get the arrow out of my arm, But it turns out, so the presenting problem is really important to deal with. And it's only important to the degree that it helps us align your use of capital with your life over time. So I think that's the biggest struggle, is like trying to communicate the value. And I always found myself, back when I had my firm, I always found myself saying to clients, like, I'm telling you right now, we're going to help you in ways that I can't even explain. You're just going to have to experience it. And to be honest, I don't know exactly what the thing will be for you, but I promise you in 18 to 24 months, there will be a thing. and you'll point to it. And so that's the biggest challenge we have in our industry is the very thing people will value most has to be experienced before they can even realize it's a valuable thing.
I love the presenting problem example. Let me challenge you a little bit. I just mentioned to listeners that, you coach a lot of advisors. When I survey the listeners of this podcast, there are clients, there are other advisors, there are do-it-yourself investors. But the one common thread is that if you're listening to a podcast called The Long-Term Investor, you are probably interested in finance. And there is some chance that your spouse has a different degree of interest, even if they're also interested. Maybe it's just different. Maybe it's more. Maybe it's less. So I'm curious, for everyone listening, their significant other probably has a different viewpoint of what their presenting problem currently is. So coach our listeners, Carl, how would you suggest that somebody starts a conversation with their significant other about what they think their situation is or their presenting problem, or if there are any problems? And again, the book is a great conversation starter, but let's kind of dive in and coach those listening right now. How can they start this conversation?
Yeah, it's a super good question. And to be clear, I'm sure that your spouse or partner's view of the situation is different than yours. 100%, right? Like, because it always is. And so what I think the most valuable thing I've seen, I've probably had, I'm trying to be careful about exaggerating, but I think thousands is fair of conversations about money, certainly lots and lots of hundreds. And what I've noticed to be the most important thing is to just start paying attention. And there's a couple of essays actually in the book about this. There's, I remember clients, somebody saying something like that one spouse was totally focused on wanting to pay down the mortgage, and the other spouse was completely focused on investing. So they had a little bit of extra cash above so they could make extra principal payments on their mortgage, or they could invest. And this turned into quite an argument, actually. And what in those cases, if you can get to the value underneath it, right? So get away from the presenting issue. Like, I want to pay down the mortgage. I want to make an investment. Let's buy some more real estate. If you can get below, like, hey, and all it takes is just one little question. First of all, noticing, like, instead of being sort of like in this unconscious, like almost like I'm pushing my hands together, like butting heads, pausing and just saying, hey, whoa, wait, could help me understand what's behind that? Like this scene, here's a great statement. It's really clear to me this is very important to you. Like, so now I'm the aggressive real estate investor guy, and I'm talking to my partner, and I'm saying, my spouse, my partner, and I'm saying, and my partner just wants to pay down the mortgage. And in fact, this would be reverse in our relationship. Who cares, right? I could just say, hey, it's really clear to me that paying down the mortgage is important to you. It seems to keep coming up. Help me understand why that's important. Right, so just some acknowledgement that it's really important to you. I mean, Peter, you see this one probably all the time. One of the most conflict-prone issues is education funding. Like, I see this more often with couples. Like, one spouse is like, I paid my way through law school. They're going to pay their way through law school, and the other spouse is like, wait, I thought we were prepared to pay for Harvard if they get in. And often you discover this for the very first time in a conversation with a third party, like an advisor maybe. So again, same question. Like, man, it seems really important to you. Why is this important? And what ends up happening, like in the case of the mortgage versus investing in real estate, you get to a spot where you're like, oh, like having a more secure financial future. You might find a very common, in fact, I'm almost positive you'll find a common value. If you can just set aside the right or wrong thing for an issue, change what Stephen Covey said is like, instead of trying to be understood, seek first to understand. So just switch the conversation and be like, you know what? Forget that I want to invest a different way. That, like, we can talk about that in a minute. Help me understand what is that? Like, when did that first occur to you? What have you read that's been helpful? Is that something that was important in your family? These are all like layered questions that you can get to, because what you almost always, if you can hold space for that kind of conversation, you'll almost always find a value that you agree on. And in this case, like a more secure financial future. And you're just simply saying we have different paths to it. Now we're in a different discussion. We have a common value that we care about, and we're just debating almost like the merits of different ways of getting there. And that could lead to easy conversations of like, hey, I got an idea. What if we trade off? Like this year we'll send that money to the mortgage next year. Or what if we do 50-50? Or you know what? It's so important to you. This actually isn't that important to me. I can do something else. Let's focus on paying down. That's a great idea. Let's focus on. It's funny how emotional I can feel the empathy of those sorts of conversations, because I've seen them end in divorce, right? I've seen them end in worse than divorce, which is hard to imagine, but financial stress is the number one cause of adult male suicide, right? So if we can get to the spot where we're like, oh, wait, now I understand you. I can have deep empathy for that. And I could probably say, who cares, right? Like, I don't need this thing. Let's focus on what's important to you. Or I can come up with some negotiation, but I've got some ground to stand on.
I appreciate you sharing those thoughts, Carl, and listening to you speak just transforms me into a client meeting. But as I mentioned, so many of my listeners, I think, don't use advisors. They really enjoy doing the work themselves. And I think there's not a how-to guide on these conversations. And I think, again, this is a promotional comment, but I mean it, that this book gives you, the arsenal to spark conversations. Now, whether or not our listeners can handle those conversations with grace, that's a totally different thing. And it's one of those things that real financial planners do that probably gets a little underappreciated in the grand scheme of things. Seeing how much time I have left of yours, maybe I can kind of get into, I don't know if I want to call it a lightning round, but I went way off script. I have all these drawings that I love that I wanted to ask you about. And you've mentioned, especially on the front end of our conversation, micro actions a couple times. And I really love this. Can you give us a handful of quick moves that you see really compounding for somebody?
Yeah, I define a macro action as something so small that it almost doesn't feel like it's worth doing. And this comes back to like BJ Fogg's work on tiny habits and a little bit of James Clear, Atomic Habits. But BJ Fogg was sort of an early person to write about this. He was like, look, if you want to create a habit of flossing your teeth, don't just floss one tooth. Right? Just like that was the definition of a micro habit, because, the chances of you actually flossing one tooth when you've got the floss out and doing it, you'll probably do 2 or 3 or maybe the whole top row, So that's the definition of a micro action. And I think, there's lots of examples in finance, right? Like you use the word compound. But let's just stick with our theme here for a minute. Like I think the micro action of extending grace next time the subject of money comes up would compound, right? Like if you could change, and this is like I one time sent out an email to 35,000 people on my email list back then. And I said, it was a simple question. I just said, how many of you have fights with a spouse or partner about money? That was it. I said, just hit reply, say yes or no. And I got all these yeses. Yes, we fight about money. So then I went back through and was like, could you tell me more? Could you tell me more? It was thousands of replies. And I was reading through the replies, and there was one, it's actually in the book. There was one that said something like, yes, we fight all the time. It feels accusatory if she would just spend less, if I would just spend less. It's like all these really, like, it was like, it's so hard. And then I was like, wow, this is really dramatic as I was reading it. And then it was signed, the signature was literally the spouse. And I looked up and it was my wife's email address. And so a tiny micro action that you could establish there is like the next time an American Express bill gets opened and you feel, and I would really start paying attention to the feeling in your body, because your body will tell you long before your mind will catch up. And I could give you hundreds of stories about that. Like, anyway, if you can pay attention to the feeling, Katie Arnold, who wrote Running Home, the great memoir Running Home, I interviewed her one time, and she said, Every time her husband opens the mail in the other room, she can hear the mail being opened. She has to leave the house. This has been going on for 20 years because she's worried it's about bills. You know, that there's going to be some argument. Well, a micro action could be no argument today, right? Like, I'm just going to go on a walk. So that's one example. Of course, dollar cost averaging, and of course, rebalancing, of course, all those things. But I think if we want to change our basic financial lives, learning to talk about money without it turning into a fight would be a good place to start.
I can't think of a good transition to this next sketch that I want to talk
just
about.
Do it.
So I'm just going to do it. Yeah. The worry list. I mean, tell me about the worry list. What was the inspiration behind that?
I was just noticing how often, and I still notice it regularly. I was just thinking about this the other day, actually. You know, the number of times, and we always attribute things to Mark Twain if we can't figure out who said them, but it was something like
really
I've had
Einstein,
I've had 100 worries and a few of them have happened. You know, the number of times I'd worried about something and then it never happened. And then Eckhart Tolle's work around like a problem really is just something that may or may not happen in the future. It's, you know, and often it doesn't happen. So it got me thinking about like how often, you know, because the sketch is, it's like it's meant to look like a little piece of paper. So there's just a line around the outside edge, and it says, you know, I can't remember exactly what it says, but something like a list of things
helped by worry. And at the bottom in parentheses, it goes, it's blank.
Yeah. I can't now. There is some probably like definitional issues here. A list of things helped by thinking carefully about them and being strategic. Okay, there would be a whole list of them. Worry in my mind, what I'm saying, and I think there's some definitional validity to this, is this obsessive, you know, recurring thoughts around something that might happen in the future. Is how I believe worry is close to how worry is defined. So I can't come up with any reason that worry's been helpful.
I mentioned having a big list of questions, and one of them was a string of investment questions headlined by that, because I feel like had this book come out when markets weren't at all-time highs, you know, there are always things to worry about in the market, but at the end of the day, it's not anything you can actually control.
Yep.
And it's generally stuff that just leads to bad decisions. Let me close out with one more. Again, big pivot. The circle of gratitude. I'm curious if there's a gratitude practice in your mind that most reliably changes our money decisions.
Yeah, this would relate probably to another essay in there around enough. And I think... And another concept in the book around abundance. And these are all such tricky concepts, right? Like gratitude, abundance, enough. There's so much to talk about around each of them. But I think to me, maybe the question I'm trying to ask myself more is, in fact, this just came up yesterday again. Like maybe I already have everything I need. If I was just 10% more present with what I have, right? The gratitude practice to me is like, can I take a desire for a thing? Maybe it showed up on Instagram or something. I want that thing. Going back to our conversation earlier, can I understand what's the value I'm trying to capture? I want that thing. A neighbor's got a new $150,000 wake surfing boat, for example, just hypothetically. I want a $150,000 wake surfing boat. So I can focus on that, and I don't have enough, and I'm not feeling super grateful as I'm focusing on that. Or I could say, okay, why would that be important to me? And it's really easy for me to quickly be like, oh, time with friends and family. Boat's such a great way to do that. And then I can ask myself another question. Are there other ways to do that? Oh, you know, there are other ways to do that. I could go on a walk with a friend. I could go on a bike ride with my daughter. And then suddenly I'm back to like, oh, that's a way I could express that same value. And now I'm starting to feel deeply grateful for what I already have. versus a little frustrated on what I don't. And so I think to me, it's always about trying to realize like the thing, there's probably a value I'm trying to express in the world based on that desire. And there might be another way to express that value. And that other way, I may already have that other way, right? So that's the gratitude practice I try to engage in.
Well, Carl, I'm grateful for you joining me here today. And I'm sure listeners and viewers are going to be grateful for the book, Your Money. You can go get it now anywhere you can buy books. And as I said in the introduction, I'm going to be giving away 25 copies of Carl's book to those of you who are leaving reviews and sending me screenshots of those reviews via email. And so, Carl, we're going to get your book into a number of people's hands, but I have no doubt whether people are familiar with your work already or are new to it somehow, they're really going to love what you put together.
Peter, means the world to me. Thank you. And just on behalf of your listeners, like I always am so impressed when, so grateful and to be honest, humbled when people spend the time to engage in conversations like this. And this is the whole goal of the book. So thanks for the work you're doing on behalf of everybody listening.
Absolutely. Everybody, as always, thanks for listening. And until next time, to long-term investing.